With me today is Dr. Amanda Cheromiah, Executive Director, Center for the Futures of Native Peoples. Amanda cares deeply about giving back to her Indigenous community and transforming spaces through visual narratives and Indigenous-focused scholarship and methodologies. Amanda, welcome to Say Hi to the Future.
Goatse, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Amanda, I was looking through what you're doing, and I know you finished up your doctorate, I think in was it 2021, if I'm
Yep.
not mistaken. And I was taking a read. I'm hoping to finish mine this year. And
Awesome.
so I started reading your abstract, and there's just what I thought was such a beautiful thought. And I'm just going to read it to you, and maybe you can tell me about it. It says, as Indigenous storytelling is circular and fluid, so is the movement of this collective narrative. Just tell me about that. It's just a beautifully written sentence.
I appreciate that. Yeah. I often see time and a lot from our Indigenous methodologies and creation stories and ways of knowing and being. Time is very fluid, where it's a lot of times, right, in Western society and academia, a lot of times time is seen as chronological, which of course there are times for that. But I believe in our Indigenous ways of knowing and being, it really is fluid. And there's a connection and there's a deep, profound meaning and understanding behind elements, whether it's nature or people or the environment or how we come together as a collective people. It's so deeply rooted in uh, this fluid nature of how we really see the world and how I see the world. But I'm not speaking for all Native people, but I definitely think, though, collectively there is this deep connection to land and nature and people. And so it is that circular, nonlinear approach to understanding and weaving through life.
So if I'm understanding fluidity, there's a connection between all time and space and the individuals who have been and who are. Is that
Yep.
kind of where we're going?
That
Okay.
is correct. Yep. When you look in terms of like the land, you consider who was once here, who is here now, and who will be here, right? And if you look in terms of like history, like for example, I'm in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and I work a lot with the archives. So there's a school here, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. It was in operation from 1879 until 1918. But I speak of it as if it's right a mile, the former grounds is a mile from where I'm sitting right now, but I speak of it very fluid in terms of, our narratives are ever changing and ever evolving. So it really is this idea, notion of living histories where it's not just in the past, but it comes up very much in the present today and in the future. So like with the archives, I'm constantly working with the archives here, but it's as if it's the living histories of today of our people. Even though I wasn't alive 100 something years ago, I'm constantly reminded of our narratives here and how it impacts us.
So just on the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, my understanding is you're the granddaughter of six relatives who attended there. Um, Look, I'm sitting here in Canada. Our history has been more than tarnished by what has come to light over the last few years. So, I mean, you're obviously much closer to it. So, talk to me about being a descendant and the impact over time on an individual or collective.
Sure. So it's six relatives that I know of so far. And as I was talking about these living histories, as more of the archives begins to evolve, I'm learning a lot more daily, usually. And so here with the Indian School, it was open for 39 years, and there was about 200 tribal communities that were represented at the school that is the former grounds of where, again, a mile where I'm sitting from right now. And I say that I came to Carlisle because the ancestors called me to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is South Central Pennsylvania, a very smaller community. And so I would not just move here just to move here. It's definitely rooted in so much history. And even 45 minutes from here is Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, which within a
Right.
span of 3 days, right, but with the Civil War, there was over 50,000 people that died. So within this span of even just 60 minutes, 60 miles from Carlisle, there's a lot that happened here. And a lot of our native people were brought here. Some paid tuition here, which was interesting fact that I
Hmm.
learned. Some students were sent here, some were prisoners of war, some were orphans. So really a whole gamut of why people were here in Carlisle. And as a descendant, my job I see is to share the stories of our people in very truthful and very accurate ways of how the school was an attempted assimilation, cultural genocide of our people. But I say attempted because I'm obviously here, right? I'm here literally standing and moving in the footsteps of my relatives. So a lot of our native people will come here to connect and to pray because it is significant what happened here and generational trauma that emerged from these residential schools like Carlisle. But I do want to note though that a lot of the Indian schools though have just a wide range of experiences and there isn't I just want to acknowledge that there's very complex and that there are multiple experiences. I think that's very important to emphasize.
So thank you for that, because I mean, I have taken away that the experience was were all truly negative, and I think again, I'm not in a position to maybe say this, but I think that the premise of them was all pretty bad, if you will. I'm not exactly sure how to say that, and I'm trying to be polite about it, but I think that, yeah, the premise, at least in Canada, what I heard and what was being done, and the, whatever was inexcusable. But there seems to have been at least some positive, if you can say, coming out of that horrific period. A strength, a galvanization, a greater understanding, maybe by the rest of us or some of the rest of us, about what happened or what that does to a group of individuals going forward.
Yeah, I see it as endurance, really. Like our native people were in this system right here in the United States and in Canada. I know that our governments, differ in how the history and so forth, but really at the core, I think the premise really was to fracture our native communities, to dismantle power, because a lot of different government entities wanted to take the land, grab the land, and so I think that there definitely was just this attempted, again, cultural erasure. But I think about our native nations that are thriving, that are flourishing, that are speaking the languages and there are communities now and here in the United States that have residential schools that are intact and are
Mm.
celebrating and welcome the cultural narratives and histories of our people. Like the Santa Fe Indian School in New Mexico is one that comes to mind. That is a boarding school for Indigenous learners and peoples, but really celebrate and embrace. So it is really a turn from like the
Okay.
Carlisle Indian School. So that's an example. But very complicated still because these
Right.
schools have really impacted our Native people and it will for generations to come.
So one of the other interesting things sort of building, or I think coming out of this, you talked to the Indigenous revolt in education. What does that mean?
Good question. So, a lot of what I learned in my doctoral program and in my master's PhD program at the University of Arizona in Tucson, which is southern Tucson, southern Arizona, what I learned is that I really can bring my cultural heritage, my cultural knowledge into the academy, into education. And my faculty mentors really encouraged that. And so the Indigenous Revolt stems off the 1680 Pueblo Revolt, which occurred in the land we now know as New Mexico here in the United States. And so essentially what happened, these Pueblo communities, which I'm from Laguna Pueblo, and currently there's 19 federally recognized Pueblo tribes in New Mexico. So in 1680, our Pueblo communities coordinated, had really come up with this system to revolt against the Spaniards that were coming up from Mexico. And so the Spaniards were really oppressing our native people in different ways in terms of religion, in terms of the language. And so our native people stood up towards the Spaniards that were moving into the land. And so on August 10th, 1680, our Pueblo people revolted, and it was a coordinated effort and overthrew the Spaniards, which really was a demonstration of just our resilience as Pueblo people and our connection to the land and to the people, to the language. And it really helped preserve our Indigenous, our Pueblo religion and language for millennia to come. So from that, I really extrapolated that from my cultural heritage and background and moved it into the Indigenous Revolt, where it's a collective, really a message of coming against, Western notions that have really historically tried to oppress our people in terms of just right down the road, the Carlisle Indian School, like the one of the tactics to erase our native people was to not speak the language in the classroom. But when I go into places now, right, how I can stand against that is introduce myself in my native languages.
Mhm.
Like I said, Gawatsi, I said hello, when you welcomed me into this space. So that's an example. So it really is a counter to what these schools were designed to do, to eradicate our people, culturally eradicate our people. So that's how I see it as the Indigenous
Okay.
revolt.
And what role did your research play, or does it play in what you're doing, and I guess bringing together the past with the current directions?
All of this, like we mentioned from the beginning, is cyclical and fluid. And so it's almost as if I've been preparing my whole life to
Hmm.
come to Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It's a place like no other. Like you just don't come to Carlisle to come to Carlisle. It's not a major metropolis city, right? You got to intentionally come here. And the reason why it's so challenging to be here sometimes is, right down the road, there's over 140 of our native relatives that are buried there that didn't leave the school. And recently, through the federal registry here in our country, they released 19 names of our young people, our young relatives who are buried there that hopefully will be repatriated in September. And so this is some heavy work. It's not for the faint-hearted, and it definitely is not for the faint-hearted to live here, in my opinion, if you're Indigenous, if you're a Native American, because of the deep-rooted history. And so when I talk about like research, all of it really is stories, right? It's all these curation of stories that have been entrusted to me, like through my dissertation, and it was about Indigenous runners. And one of those runners was Louis Tiwanima, who really inspired me, along with my mom and other runners. Louis Tiwanima was a runner here, Hopi from Arizona, and he was an Olympian and in the shadow of Jim Thorpe. And so a lot of people know Jim Thorpe, this athlete, but Jim Thorpe and Tiwanima went to the 1912 Olympics. And so Tiwanima, when I walk around this space here, again, how I say these living histories, I'm like, wow, I got to actually walk and to see, like our native people, and who they were here and who they became after they left here, if they had the opportunity to do so. So again, everything is so fluid. The histories that I learned in my living histories that I learned in my master's PhD program, my the oral history from my community and the ceremonies, that all comes together to help me survive and thrive in this significant place of remembrance for our Native communities.
Well, thank you for that. And I have to say, I have not obviously read your dissertation, only the abstract.
Mhm.
I was so jealous because you were afforded the ability to write in almost a story form,
Hmm.
um, with the fluidity as you use as a word, or a color that we're not always all afforded, and I wasn't. So
Yep.
I just love how, again, and I don't know if a million people would fall in love with an abstract the way I do because I'm a researcher as well, but kudos to your advisor and the team who embrace who you are and where you've come from, in allowing for that.
Yep, choosing your committee is essential. I
Mhm.
always tell this to students all the time for your master's thesis or PhD dissertation, your committee can make or break you. And in my case, my committee is helping me flourish. And till this day, even though I finished a few years ago, I still have their wisdom in my mind as I'm pursuing this work. I'm like, okay, Mandy, how can we, bring our culture into this, into the academy, right? Because the standard, right, has always been Western ways of knowledge and knowing. But I'm like,
Mhm.
how do we flip that? How do we revolt against that, right? How do we bring and celebrate our native knowledge in these very colonial spaces?
Right, right. And you do, I mean, there is a very, I'm not going to call it mainstream, but rising stream of storytelling and storytellers in business. um, today. And you talk a lot about storytelling, and obviously you do it with, I'm not going to say ease, but very well
Mhm.
about that. Um, how does that play into what you do and how you communicate or help people build who they are?
Yeah, so I am teaching a class this semester for the first time here at Dickinson College, which is a small liberal arts school. The students who come here pay over $80,000 per year for tuition. That's in US dollars, but a lot of money. So it's definitely a whole nother environment here. And what I know is who I am and where I'm come from and why I'm here. And so when I teach this class, like for example, the Indigenous storytelling class I teach here at Dickinson, what I do is I have to lean on the foundational elements of what makes me me. And again, welcoming people from all backgrounds to that, to this knowledge that I have here in this place. And so the way that I help communicate that with our students, a lot of times like I have these frameworks and I can break it down very simply. Like there's time is fluid. That's one framework. One is that a cultural map, and that's actually out of Professor Gregory Cajete, who's a scholar out of University of New Mexico. And essentially, he asked an elder, a native elder, how do you know how to go about this life? And the elder said, there's a cultural map in my mind that I know where to navigate. So when I'm here in Carlisle, I identify with that. I have this cultural map that I know kind of like, okay, how do I navigate? And so the challenge for me is putting that on paper sometimes. I'm like, okay, so I know these learners, need things on paper like a syllabus, right? And so, but it really is like, as I describe these frameworks to them, I'm like, you're coming into this way of knowing, right? That I know from my indigenous community that's over 2,000 miles away from where I'm sitting right now, right? So it's really like helping them methodically think about and really flip how they think about class, right? Like
Mhm.
today we talked about indigenous storytellers through children's books, and we looked at how are narratives shared through children's books, so then after that we created our own story. I'm like, come with one line, write one sentence on this piece of paper that describes our story for our class. And it's just a powerful book that we created where
Yeah, I
each
love that.
contributing one line. So it really is like the premise is our native histories, our living histories, and I'm going to create activities and assignments that help you learn how to navigate this. And so that's kind of some examples of how I help. It is kind of step by step, because I realize we're coming from all different backgrounds. But the premise is though our native histories, our native living histories, and so I just spring from there.
I love that. And what I love about it is children's stories seem basic or fundamental, but there's a lot of depth and richness if you're allowed to build those layers on. But it teaches people to get down to that, the simplicity of the story. Um, I teach corporate strategy. My first opening is always about the Wizard of Oz, the path, where they're going, the steps you have to take, the wicked witches coming at you, and all that. And it's so easy to understand because people, in my experience, people look for complexity in stories. And like you, I just want the simplicity of
Hmm.
what a child understands. Because if you get that, everything works.
Hmm. I agree. It's all about how you want to create these learning spaces. I tell them in my class from the very beginning, I'm like, you can doodle while I'm teaching, you can draw while I'm teaching, because again, that expression was so limited within our native communities in these classrooms, right? I keep pointing down that way, like because the old Indian school is that way, but there was just a limit on expression, and I'm like, I'm gonna counter that. Where in my class, you can come here and express yourself. That's a revolt again, right? You can come in here and freely express yourself. Like we have a syllabus. I know that. If you need extension, let me know. Like it's so fluid to me. Like I care about the learners. My whole philosophy with in being in higher education and connecting with people is that I care to build the confidence of our people. And when I say people, it's everybody. And
Mhm.
when I my whole life mission though is for our native people. Because when you build the confidence of people, there's no telling what they can do. So I feel like as an educator, as a sister, as a mentor, as a relative, like feel like I have that responsibility here to help build the confidence of our learners.
And when you do that, so I read too about implementing indigenous focused ways of knowing and being. Is that is that what the storytelling expresses? Is
Yes.
that what you're helping to bring out?
Yep, yep, it's that. It's really the focus, right? The oral tradition, which of course isn't exclusive to our Native people, but I
Mhm.
do know it in the framework, of course, of our Native people, that the oral tradition has been here since time immemorial. And so I honor that oral tradition and that component. And so when I share like these values, right? So I tell my students like I've had the opportunity to travel to like Canada and of course connect with our native people here in the United States, some in Mexico, some in New Zealand, and some in Australia. And what I've learned is that the cultural values are very similar among our native people in all those different countries. And it's giving back, taking care of one another, right? Respecting the land. Like these are some very similar cultural values, but how we live those out is what makes us different, right? And in our respective nations, communities, reservations, reserves, right? Like, and so when I'm communicating this, it is all these different elements. And another framework I use too is also a spider web framework. And this also helps students really kind of connect the pieces. So this was a part of my dissertation, but Dozier Enos, who is a scholar out of New Mexico, one of our Pueblo native scholars, she described research in the context of it being very nonlinear, can be very messy, right? You think about your own journey, right? You might have like 20 post-it notes on the mirror, you might have 30 books on your desk, like 20 windows open on your, Safari, whatever. And it's very messy, nonlinear. But she asserts that in this research process, you are making a spider web where each strand is very intentional, but you're creating something very beautiful. So I extrapolate that framework, spiderweb framework, to the work here. So, like, you're a strand. This podcast is a strand. Our podcast, the Indigenous Revolt, is a strand, right? All these strands are coming together that are forming something very beautiful and very powerful coming out of Carlisle, Pennsylvania. So that's kind of how I also describe it too as a spiderweb framework.
Very beautiful. So you talked about Arizona.
Hmm.
You've talked about Carlisle. I saw Alaska, but you just it's funny when you were describing Carlisle, I was thinking it's smaller and more out of the way than wherever you were in Alaska. I was a little taken by that, but because I'm not too far away from Pennsylvania. But tell me about 5,000 miles or so away, New Zealand,
Oh, yeah.
Australia, the indigenous peoples and findings.
Oh my gosh, that is a life-changing experience. Listeners, relatives who are tuning in, if you ever have a chance to go to those countries, oh my goodness, it is beautiful. In Australia, we went to Tasmania, which is, I only knew Tasmania because of Looney Tunes and the Tasmanian Devil. But it's like this little island off of, mainland Australia. And there it was really fascinating because a group of like 20 or so native relatives that I was a part of went and studied abroad there for a few weeks, and being able to connect with the land was powerful. To see kangaroos out in the wild, that was quite an experience to see that. But connecting with the native people there was really profound in the sense that their cultural histories were very similar to our histories too, in terms of colonization, in terms of land grab. I found that I identified a lot. But one thing that was interesting about Australia was that when the people there, the native people spoke, they would say "I am," and then they would say their tribal community. Now, here in the United States, a lot of times what I hear from our native people is I hear fractions. Oh, I'm part Navajo, I'm part Laguna, or I'm part, or I'm half this or half that. Oh, I'm a quarter or I'm a 16th, whatever. So, and it's interesting because there it's like I am. And so I was always very cognizant, of that and kind of coming to this country, like because we do have blood quantum in the United States. Like I have a literal card I can pull out and show you what my blood quantum is. And I show this a lot to my students too, but I'm not going to show everything. But I have a little card to prove that I'm 31/32 native blood. Right. Like, and when I tell my students, I'm like, does anybody else have a card to show how much you are? And they're like, no. So that was really interesting in Australia. Like it was this I am. And so I'm very cognizant of that. And I'm only, I'm Laguna Pueblo and that's it. So I just say that I am this because I am. But I do think it brings up this notion of identity, and who gets to tell you what you are. I think that's a bigger conversation. And here in the United States, that's a really could be a heated discussion, right? When you talk about cards and blood quantum.
Tell me about the future. We've talked about fluidity and we've talked about connectivity and the work you did through academia, but now you're bringing that, you know, out to the world through storytelling and helping others. Why are you doing it?
Yeah.
Yeah, why are you doing it? And what's the end purpose of your life's journey in this?
Hmm.
Maybe I should, sorry, I
Yeah.
didn't say life's journey. What's the end purpose of your work here?
Well, everything I do, I try to lead in prayer because where I live in Carlisle, Pennsylvania is rooted in so much living history and so much prayer rooted in ceremony. And I can only be here because of prayer, really, and the support from my community. And I tell my mom often, I'm like, Mom, I don't know fully what my purpose is here. And she's like, Mandy, you may never know that. And I'm okay with that. I do know that part of the story here is to help amplify our narratives, our Indigenous narratives. That's part of the journey. I understand that part of the journey is the Indigenous revolt, that is some of my responsibility here, that I am a caretaker of stories and people who come. Like I mentioned, what makes us really different here in regards to our college and the Center for Futures of Native Peoples, we call it Grandma's house. Literally, like I'm not a grandma, but I'm a granddaughter. And so the way we create our three-story colonial style house that was in existence during the Civil War is we make it like grandma's house, where we put tons of pictures in here. We have snacks, we have medicines, we got coffee, just like our my grandma does back at home in New Mexico. And because outside these walls, it can be very jarring. As a person of color, I experience so many microaggressions here in Carlisle. People wonder what I am, who I am, how much of what I am, where I'm from, and why I'm here. And I'm just shopping at like our local stores here, and I get stopped all the time, and because of how I look or how I occupy space. And so it's a jarring place to live. And so that's why I say prayer is always at the core. And I'll share a real quick story is that I'm on TikTok and social media and share stories all the time. And one thing that resonated with me recently, given the current climate of our countries and our nations and policies that are shifting, is that I think we need to look to the ants, the ants, the ants, the small little creatures, because
Mhm.
one little ant can carry like 20 to 50 times their weight, which is remarkable to me. So one person can carry a lot when I think about this, right? I'm thinking of extrapolating this to ants and people. So, but when ants, when they're powerful by themselves, but when they come together, they create these magnificent civilizations that the people know their part, and as they move together, they just flourish in their colonies and in their communities. They're these ant communities. So I think that we're the ants. I think that there's pockets of movements of people, making change, but I really think that there needs to be more ants in this movement to really start shaking up things in a way that's good and that's positive. And so I'm here to figure out what that means, but I know for sure that I can pray for the people, that I can share that widely, because in this very place our narratives were so oppressed and so they were used for propaganda, but now I can do it in a good way, in a positive way. So all in all, I think prayer is always the core. That's how I know where I'm going about in this cultural map I have in my head.
Well, Dr. Amanda Cheromiah, thank you again for joining us today. And again, I just the way it's not even writing, it's the prose and the narrative in the images that you bring out when you write. I really hope that that capacity for storytelling that you're working on gets out into the broader world or what have you, because again, we're out here in business talking more about storytelling, but you have a gift in it. Obviously, in listening to you, it comes from generations of storytelling and
Mhm.
connectivity through storytelling. And I really hope that gets out more because it's really quite wonderful. So
Mm.
thank you again.
Though I thank you. I really appreciate that. I think that's prophetic. I've heard that from different folks throughout my work here and my time here. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.